Some people mistake silence for weakness, right up until the moment they realize they were listening to the calm before everything changes. The lunch hall at Blackridge State Penitentiary never stayed quiet for long. Trays scraped across steel tables, boots echoed over concrete, and hundreds of conversations blended into a restless roar that seemed to live inside the walls themselves. Every inmate understood the unwritten rules. Keep your head down. Respect the wrong people if you wanted an easier day. And never become entertainment for the men who believed fear was another form of currency. On that gray Tuesday afternoon, the heavy doors opened with their familiar metallic groan, and a man stepped inside, carrying nothing except a white mobility cane and the steady patience of someone who had long ago learned to move through darkness without asking anyone for help. His name was Elias Brooks, 54 years old, blind, black, dressed in the same orange uniform as everyone else. His pace never changed as he listened to the sound around him instead of searching for faces he could no longer see. Every tap of the cane measured distance. Every footstep told him where people stood. Every whisper painted a picture more accurate than sight ever could. Around the cafeteria, conversations slowed one by one. Some inmates exchanged amused smiles. Others simply watched. A few older prisoners quietly lowered their eyes, recognizing something they could not quite explain. Across the room, Travis Cole leaned back against a table surrounded by the men who followed him everywhere. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always eager to remind everyone who controlled cell block D. Travis noticed the newcomer immediately. To him, weakness was an invitation. A blind inmate walking alone looked less like a man and more like an opportunity to entertain an audience that expected him to put on a show. His grin spread slowly as nearby inmates sensed what was coming. Several chuckled before anything had even happened. Others looked away, unwilling to become part of another humiliating moment that would be forgotten before dinner. Elias continued forward without hesitation. The sounds of metal, chairs shifting, shallow laughter, and deliberate footsteps moving into his path reached him long before anyone spoke. He stopped naturally, neither nervous nor confrontational, simply waiting as though he already understood exactly who stood in front of him. Travis tilted his head, amused that the newcomer had paused so precisely. "Looks like somebody knows where the road ends," he joked, earning scattered laughter from the surrounding tables. Elias answered with nothing but quiet breathing. No anger, no pleading, no fear, just silence that somehow felt heavier than words. The grin on Travis's face widened as he glanced around at the growing crowd. More inmates were watching now, drawn by the promise of another easy target. What none of them realized was that the man standing calmly with a white cane had already noticed every shifting boot, every nervous heartbeat hidden beneath forced laughter, and every inch separating him from the people who believed they understood exactly who he was. Travis Cole took one slow step closer until only a few feet separated him from Elias Brooks. The cafeteria had become strangely attentive, as though the entire room had agreed to postpone lunch in favor of whatever happened next. Even the correctional officers stationed near the serving line glanced toward the growing circle of inmates before quietly returning to their routines. They had seen countless confrontations begin with loud voices and bruised egos, but this one carried a different kind of tension that was difficult to explain. Elias remained perfectly still, his white cane resting lightly against the concrete floor, while his head tilted ever so slightly, almost as if he were listening to something beyond the laughter surrounding him. Travis mistook the silence for uncertainty. He folded his arms and circled slowly, speaking loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "You picked the wrong block if you think people are going to take care of you around here." Several inmates laughed on cue. Others forced smiles because refusing to laugh could make them the next target. Yet a handful of older prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. One gray-haired inmate quietly pushed his lunch tray aside without taking another bite. Another lowered his eyes toward the table, avoiding the scene altogether. They were not afraid for Elias. They seemed worried about something else entirely. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Everyone has a choice about the kind of man they become. The sentence was simple, almost gentle, but it landed with unexpected weight. Travis frowned for a moment before smirking again. "You planning to give speeches now?" More laughter echoed through the room, although this time it sounded thinner than before. Elias answered only with silence. He neither argued nor apologized. His breathing remained slow, steady, and remarkably controlled despite dozens of eyes fixed upon him. Somewhere behind the crowd, a food service cart rattled across the floor. A spoon slipped from another inmate's tray and spun briefly before coming to rest. A ventilation fan hummed overhead with its familiar, uneven rhythm. Elias seemed to register every sound naturally, almost effortlessly, while never moving his feet. One correctional officer named Daniel Mercer happened to notice the unusual stillness in the newcomer's posture. During 15 years inside Blackridge State Penitentiary, Mercer had learned that confidence rarely announced itself with loud voices. Sometimes it appeared as patience. Sometimes it appeared as restraint. He watched Elias for another few seconds before quietly folding his arms, his expression becoming thoughtful instead of concerned. Travis interpreted the continued silence as permission to keep pushing. He glanced around at the growing audience, enjoying the attention more than the confrontation itself. To him, respect had always been something collected through intimidation. He believed every prison operated under that single rule. What he could not recognize was that the room had already begun to change. The laughter was fading. Curiosity was replacing amusement. And although almost nobody understood why, the atmosphere inside the cafeteria no longer belonged to the loudest man standing there. The silence lingered just long enough for everyone to notice it. In a place where voices usually competed, with clanging trays and echoing doors, even a few seconds without laughter felt unusual. Travis Cole shifted his weight and studied the blind man more carefully. Something about Elias Brooks refused to fit the picture he had already painted in his mind. Most newcomers either tried too hard to appear fearless or immediately revealed their anxiety. Elias did neither. He simply stood with relaxed shoulders, one hand resting lightly on the white cane, as though he had all the time in the world. The confidence unsettled people in ways they could not explain. Along the far wall, Officer Daniel Mercer quietly observed the gathering crowd without stepping in. Prison experience had taught him that the loudest confrontation was not always the most dangerous one. Sometimes the situations that began with calm voices ended by changing the way an entire housing unit viewed itself. He glanced toward another veteran officer, Linda Hayes, who had worked at Blackridge for more than 2 decades. She noticed the same unusual atmosphere. Neither of them spoke. Neither wanted to interrupt what was unfolding unless absolutely necessary. Across the cafeteria, whispers traveled from one table to another. Nobody knew Elias Brooks. His file had arrived only that morning, and very few details had circulated through the inmate rumor mill. Some claimed he had spent years in another state facility. Others insisted he had once worked for the military before disappearing from public records. One inmate even suggested the blindness had happened during a prison riot years earlier. Every version sounded different, yet nobody could point to a single confirmed fact. Only Elias knew the truth, and he showed no interest in correcting anyone. Travis noticed the uncertainty spreading through the room and smiled to himself. Rumors meant nothing. Reputation inside Blackridge depended on what happened in front of witnesses, not on stories carried from somewhere else. If he embarrassed the newcomer in front of everyone, the questions would disappear by dinner. At least that was how it had always worked before. Elias slowly lifted his face toward the sound surrounding him. The distant buzz of fluorescent lights, the steady hum of the ventilation system, boots moving across polished concrete, the faint rattle of keys hanging from an officer's belt. To everyone else, those noises blended into ordinary background clutter. To him, they formed a complete map of the room, constantly changing with every movement. His expression remained peaceful, almost thoughtful, as though he were listening to a familiar melody instead of standing at the center of growing tension. Several older inmates exchanged another uneasy glance. One quietly murmured, "He is counting." The words were barely audible, disappearing beneath the cafeteria noise before most people heard them. Travis certainly did not. He took another confident step forward, convinced the room still belonged to him. What he failed to recognize was that the audience had stopped waiting for him to act. Without realizing it, every eye had begun drifting back toward the quiet man who had not raised his voice even once. Travis Cole glanced around the cafeteria, expecting another wave of laughter, but the response came slower than before. The attention he usually controlled so easily had begun slipping in a direction that frustrated him without revealing why. Elias Brooks had done almost nothing, yet somehow he had become the center of the room simply by refusing to play the role everyone expected. That quiet confidence irritated Travis more than open defiance ever could. He believed every person had a breaking point, and he had built his reputation by finding it. Elias slowly adjusted his grip on the white cane before resting it lightly against the floor once again. His movements were neither hurried nor uncertain. They carried the rhythm of habit, repeated so many times that every gesture appeared effortless. He seemed completely aware of the shifting crowd despite never turning his head toward the growing circle of spectators. A younger inmate standing near the serving line whispered, "How does he keep looking at people without seeing them?" An older prisoner answered softly, "He is not looking. He is listening." The words disappeared into the background noise, but Officer Daniel Mercer happened to hear them. He continued, studying Elias with growing curiosity. During orientation that morning, Mercer had noticed something unusual in the transfer paperwork. Nearly every section describing Elias Brooks had been ordinary, yet several pages regarding his earlier incarceration had been heavily restricted. The prison administration had instructed staff to focus only on current procedures and avoid unnecessary discussion about his past. That alone had been enough to catch Mercer's attention. Blackridge rarely received inmates whose records arrived with so many unanswered questions. Linda Hayes remembered something else. While escorting Elias through intake, she had accidentally dropped a clipboard nearly 10 feet behind him. Before it even struck the floor, Elias had calmly stepped aside without hesitation. At the time, she assumed it was coincidence. Watching him now, she was no longer certain. Across the cafeteria, Travis slowly began circling again, trying to reclaim the confidence that had started fading from the room. He smiled broadly for the audience, but the expression no longer carried the same certainty. Every joke seemed to dissolve before reaching the back tables. Every attempt to provoke a reaction was met by the same patient silence. Elias finally lifted his chin slightly. "You do not have to prove your strength to strangers," he said in a calm voice. "The strongest people rarely feel that need. No accusation, no challenge, just a quiet observation delivered without anger." Several inmates lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uncertain looks. Even those who had laughed moments earlier found themselves saying nothing. Travis forced another smile, yet it felt thinner now. He had expected fear, excuses, or desperate pleading. Instead, he faced someone who spoke as though none of this was personal. Somewhere inside Blackridge State Penitentiary, the afternoon routine continued exactly on schedule. Doors opened and closed. Radios crackled. Officers changed posts. But inside the cafeteria, an invisible line had already been crossed. Nobody knew exactly what would happen next. They only sensed that the story everyone expected had quietly begun turning into something entirely different. Travis Cole could feel the attention slipping through his fingers, and nothing frustrated him more than losing control in front of an audience. For years, he had built his reputation on certainty. Every new arrival eventually followed the same pattern. They either challenged him and regretted it, or they surrendered before the first real test began. That simple formula had never failed him inside Blackridge State Penitentiary. Yet the quiet man, standing only a few feet away, refused to fit into either category. Elias Brooks neither resisted nor submitted. He simply existed with an unusual composure that made everyone else increasingly uncomfortable. Travis convinced himself there had to be an explanation. Perhaps the blind inmate simply did not understand where he was. Perhaps someone had protected him in another facility. Perhaps he was too proud to admit he was afraid. Whatever the answer might be, Travis decided he would force it into the open. He stepped closer again, speaking loudly enough for every nearby table to hear. You know what your problem is? You still think respect is free. Elias did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his face toward the familiar sound of Travis's voice with remarkable precision. His expression remained peaceful, almost thoughtful. Respect is earned, Elias finally replied. Fear is only borrowed. It never belongs to the person who demands it. The sentence settled over the cafeteria with unexpected weight. Several inmates exchanged silent glances. Even those who rarely questioned Travis began paying closer attention to the conversation itself, instead of waiting for another humiliating spectacle. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed the subtle shift immediately. People were no longer reacting because Travis wanted them to. They were reacting because they genuinely wanted to understand the man standing before him. That difference mattered. Linda Hayes quietly moved a few feet closer, not because she expected trouble, but because instinct told her something important was unfolding. Her instincts had rarely failed her during 23 years inside prison walls. Across the room, one inmate leaned toward another and whispered, "He sounds like somebody who has already lived through worse than this." The reply came almost instantly. Maybe that is exactly what happened. Rumors multiplied with every passing second. Someone claimed Elias had once trained police academies before disappearing from public life. Another insisted he had survived years in a federal facility where even experienced inmates refused to speak his name. None of the stories could be verified, yet every new whisper made the mystery surrounding him grow larger. Elias ignored every rumor completely. He neither corrected them nor encouraged them. He simply stood with the same measured patience, listening to the room as though every heartbeat, every shifting chair, and every nervous breath belonged to a conversation only he could fully understand. Travis interpreted the silence as another challenge to his authority. What he failed to recognize was that the audience had already changed sides emotionally. They were no longer waiting to see whether the quiet newcomer would break. They had begun wondering why he had remained so calm from the very first moment he entered the cafeteria, and that unanswered question had become far more powerful than anything Travis could say. The tension that had been building beneath the ordinary sounds of the cafeteria finally became impossible to ignore. Conversations faded into scattered whispers, and even the inmates who usually avoided attention found themselves watching without pretending otherwise. Elias Brooks remained exactly where he had been, his posture relaxed, his breathing slow, and his expression unchanged. The white cane rested lightly against the floor, no longer looking like a symbol of weakness, but like an extension of a discipline nobody could quite understand. Travis Cole took another deliberate step forward, determined to reclaim the moment before it slipped away completely. He had spent years convincing everyone inside Blackridge that confidence belonged to the loudest voice in the room. Yet the quiet man before him continued dismantling that belief without raising his own. Travis laughed, but the sound felt forced this time. "You think standing there quietly makes you impressive?" he asked. Elias answered in the same calm tone that had unsettled everyone since he arrived. "No, it simply keeps me from becoming someone I would regret." The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Several inmates looked down at their trays, while others stared openly at Elias, as though trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed that even Travis's closest followers had stopped laughing automatically. They were waiting instead, uncertain which direction the afternoon would take. Travis refused to accept that uncertainty. He slowly reached out and nudged the white cane with the toe of his boot, sending it sliding several feet across the polished concrete floor. Gasps quietly spread through the cafeteria. The movement itself was brief, almost casual, yet it carried enough disrespect that everyone understood its meaning immediately. Elias did not move after the cane left his hand. He remained standing exactly where he was, his hands resting naturally at his sides. For the first time since entering the cafeteria, complete silence settled across the room. Even the clatter of silverware seemed to disappear beneath the weight of expectation. Officer Linda Hayes instinctively took one cautious step forward before stopping herself. Daniel Mercer noticed the change in Elias instead. It was almost invisible. His shoulders remained relaxed. His breathing never quickened. Yet something about his stillness became even more deliberate, as though every sound inside the cafeteria had suddenly become sharper than before. Elias slowly turned his face toward Travis with flawless precision. There was no anger in his voice when he finally spoke. "That was your last warning." The sentence was delivered so quietly that nobody could mistake it for a threat. It sounded more like a statement of fact than an emotional reaction. Travis smiled confidently, believing the silence around him meant victory. He never noticed that the older inmates had quietly leaned back from their tables. He never noticed Officer Mercer exchanging a brief glance with Linda Hayes. Most importantly, he never realized that the room was no longer waiting to see what the loudest man would do next. Every eye had already shifted toward the man who had never needed to raise his voice to command the attention of an entire prison. The next few seconds unfolded so quietly that several inmates would later struggle to describe exactly what they had witnessed. Nobody shouted. Nobody rushed forward. The entire cafeteria seemed suspended between one heartbeat and the next as Travis Cole took another confident step toward Elias Brooks, convinced the warning he had just heard carried no real meaning. His followers watched with eager anticipation, expecting the familiar ending they had seen so many times before. Officer Daniel Mercer remained perfectly still, although every instinct told him not to look away. Linda Hayes noticed something almost impossible to explain. Elias had not reached for the white cane lying several feet away. He had not searched for it with his hands. Instead, he stood with complete composure listening. The uneven buzz from the ceiling lights, the slow vibration of the ventilation system, the scrape of a chair somewhere behind him, the quiet shift of leather boots against polished concrete. Every sound seemed to settle naturally into place. Travis smiled and reached out again, intending to provoke one final reaction. Before anyone understood what had happened, Elias made the smallest adjustment imaginable. It was less a step than a smooth change in balance, so subtle that many observers questioned whether he had moved at all. Travis halted unexpectedly, his confident expression giving way to genuine surprise. The movement he had expected was simply not there. Instead of finding uncertainty, he found remarkable control. Elias spoke in the same calm voice that had never once risen above conversation. "There is still time to walk away." The invitation hung in the air. It contained no anger, no pride, and no desire to embarrass anyone. It sounded sincere, almost compassionate. For one brief moment, several inmates believed the confrontation might actually end there. Even Officer Mercer quietly hoped Travis would recognize the opportunity in front of him. But years of unquestioned dominance had made backing down feel impossible. Travis forced a laugh and looked around for approval that never fully arrived. The crowd no longer responded on command. They watched in complete silence, waiting for the next decision. Elias slowly inclined his head as though listening to something only he could hear. His breathing never changed. His shoulders remained relaxed. Every motion reflected years of discipline rather than tension. One older inmate quietly whispered, "He already knows where everyone is standing." Another answered, "He has known since he walked through the door." Linda Hayes felt an unexpected chill despite the warm cafeteria. She suddenly remembered the intake report describing Elias as unusually cooperative, unusually observant, and exceptionally composed under pressure. At the time, those words had seemed ordinary. Standing there now, they carried an entirely different meaning. Travis finally realized that nothing about the afternoon had followed the script he expected. The audience had stopped admiring confidence built on intimidation. Without anyone announcing it, respect had begun gathering around the quiet man who had offered patience instead of pride, restraint instead of anger, and one final chance before the story reached a point that nobody in Black Ridge State Penitentiary would soon forget. Officer Daniel Mercer broke the silence first, although his voice was barely louder than a whisper. Everybody take one step back. It was not an order delivered with urgency. It sounded more like the careful advice of someone who suddenly understood far more than everyone else in the room. Several inmates obeyed without questioning him. Others remained frozen where they stood, unable to look away from Elias Brooks. Travis Cole frowned, confused by the unexpected reaction. He had expected officers to focus on restoring order, not to watch the quiet newcomer with growing respect. Linda Hayes slowly approached Mercer without taking her eyes off Elias. "You remember something?" she asked quietly. Mercer nodded almost imperceptibly. "Not from here," he replied. "From years ago." The words caught her attention immediately. Mercer had spent part of his career working alongside federal agencies before transferring to Blackridge, and there were stories he rarely discussed. He continued watching Elias for another moment before speaking again. There was an instructor they brought in for specialized defensive training. Nobody talked much about him. He never demonstrated unnecessary force. He taught people how to avoid conflict before it ever became physical. They said he could understand an entire room without looking at anyone inside it. Linda looked back toward Elias, her expression slowly changing. "You think it is him?" Mercer answered carefully. "I think I have not seen that level of composure in almost 15 years. The realization spread more quickly than either officer expected. One inmate recognized Mercer's expression before hearing the conversation itself. Another noticed the veteran officers were no longer treating Elias like an ordinary transfer. Rumors instantly took on a different tone. Instead of guessing who he might be, people began wondering who he had once been. Elias remained completely unaware of the whispers moving through the cafeteria, or perhaps he simply chose not to acknowledge them. His attention never drifted from the sounds surrounding him. Every quiet breath, every nervous shift of weight, every heartbeat hidden beneath forced confidence. It was as though the entire room had become a language only he could understand. Mercer quietly remembered a lesson from years earlier. The instructor had stood before experienced officers and said, "The purpose of skill is not to win. The purpose of skill is to leave everyone with a chance to walk away." At the time, Mercer had never forgotten those words, although he had forgotten the instructor's name. Looking at Elias now, the memory returned with startling clarity. Travis noticed the officers exchanging glances and finally sensed that something had changed beyond his understanding. For the first time that afternoon, uncertainty crossed his face. He searched the crowd for reassurance, but found only silence. Nobody was smiling anymore. Nobody seemed interested in entertainment. The atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to quiet respect, and that transformation had nothing to do with reputation or rumors. It came from watching one man remain completely calm while everyone around him slowly realized that true strength had never been demanding attention. It had been standing peacefully in front of them the entire time. The cafeteria remained unusually quiet long after the confrontation had lost its momentum. Travis Cole slowly lowered his gaze, realizing that whatever authority he had expected to reinforce that afternoon had quietly slipped beyond his reach. Nobody applauded. Nobody mocked him. The audience had discovered something far more powerful than another prison spectacle. They had witnessed restraint chosen over pride, patience placed above intimidation, and confidence that never needed permission from anyone else. Elias Brooks calmly took a few measured steps toward the white cane still resting on the polished concrete floor. Without hesitation, he bent down and picked it up with practiced ease before holding it lightly in one hand once again. His expression never changed. There was no satisfaction, no celebration, and certainly no desire to embarrass another human being. To him, the moment appeared already finished. Officer Linda Hayes quietly exhaled, almost unaware she had been holding her breath. Daniel Mercer watched Elias for another second before giving a small respectful nod that did not go unnoticed by several inmates. Inside Blackridge State Penitentiary, respect from a veteran officer was never given carelessly. The simple gesture carried more meaning than any speech ever could. Travis looked around the cafeteria one final time, hoping someone would restore the familiar balance he had always depended upon. Instead, the room answered with thoughtful silence. Even the inmates who usually followed him, without question, seemed uncertain, as though they had suddenly realized there were different kinds of strength than the ones they had admired for years. Elias adjusted the white cane and quietly turned toward an empty table near the far wall. He walked there with the same steady rhythm that had carried him through the prison doors earlier that day. Every step reflected discipline rather than hesitation. Every movement suggested a man who had long ago accepted circumstances without allowing them to define him. As he sat down, another inmate carefully approached and asked in a respectful voice, "Would you like me to tell you what is on today's menu?" Elias smiled gently. "Thank you," he replied. Kindness is always easier to remember than fear. The simple answer spread through the cafeteria more quickly than any rumor had all afternoon. It reached inmates, officers, kitchen workers, and even people who had not witnessed the beginning of the encounter. By evening count, stories about the quiet newcomer had already traveled through every housing unit inside Blackridge. Yet the details sounded different depending on who told them. Some spoke about remarkable composure. Others remembered the mysterious confidence that never disappeared. A few repeated Daniel Mercer's old story about a forgotten instructor whose greatest lesson had always been avoiding unnecessary conflict. Nobody knew exactly how much of the legend was true. They only knew one thing with certainty. From that day forward, nobody referred to Elias Brooks as the blind inmate anymore. They simply called him the man who never needed his eyes to see what truly mattered. Later that night, as the prison settled into its familiar silence, Warden Charles Bennett unlocked a secure personnel file marked with federal restrictions. He studied the first page, paused for several long seconds, and quietly whispered to himself, "So that is who we have been housing all along," before closing the folder with an expression that suggested the real story had only just begun.